They only looked at her for 3 seconds before deciding she did not belong there. The chandelier light over the Grand Astoria ballroom fell like liquid gold across crystal glasses, black tuxedos, and silk gowns worth more than some families made in a month. But somehow the brightest thing in the room was not the stage, not the donor wall, not even the diamond necklace turning slowly beneath the auction spotlight. It was the silence that followed Naomi Brooks as she stepped through the marble entrance with her chin high, her shoulders relaxed, and a calm that seemed almost out of place in a room built on performance. She wore a deep navy gown with clean lines and no unnecessary sparkle, the kind of elegance that did not beg to be noticed because it already knew its worth. In one hand, she carried a slim black clutch. In the other, nothing at all. No escort, no nervous smile, no need to explain herself. Around her, the annual Whitmore Children's Hope Gala unfolded with polished perfection. Waiters moved like clockwork with trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly near a wall of white roses. On the far end of the ballroom, a giant screen displayed the names of major donors in glowing gold letters, while local reporters lingered near the red carpet, hoping to catch a senator, a tech executive, or the widow of some billionaire with tears in her voice and generosity on her sleeve. Everything was smooth. Everything was curated. Everything was designed to look like goodness. And yet the moment Naomi entered, something in the air shifted. It was subtle at first, almost too polished to call out. A glance that stayed too long. A smile that never quite reached the eyes. A volunteer at the registration table asking to see her invitation twice, even though she had already shown it once. Naomi noticed all of it. She noticed the way the woman's hand paused before returning her card. The way a man in a silver bow tie looked her up and down, then leaned toward his wife and whispered behind a practiced grin. The way one server offered refills to two guests beside her without once turning in her direction. None of it was loud. That was what made it dangerous. It never had to be loud. Naomi moved deeper into the ballroom with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years understanding rooms before rooms ever understood her. Her eyes passed over the stage, the auction display, the exits, the balcony, the security personnel near the side corridor. Then they settled for just a second on the giant screen above the stage before shifting away again. A phone in her clutch vibrated once. She did not answer it. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore, founder of the Gala and queen of every society page from Manhattan to Greenwich, stood beneath a bank of cameras in a white satin gown, greeting donors with the polished warmth of a woman who had built a reputation on compassion and control. When her gaze landed on Naomi, the warmth cooled by half a degree. Not enough for the cameras to catch. More than enough for Naomi to feel. Imagine standing in a room full of people raising millions in the name of dignity while being looked at as if your presence requires an explanation. Imagine hearing violins in the background while judgment moves through the crowd faster than sound. Naomi did not flinch. She simply turned toward the auction wing, her expression unreadable, as though she had walked into storms before and learned long ago that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room determined to misread them is remain perfectly still. Naomi slowed near the silent auction corridor where the music softened and the crowd thinned into smaller islands of polished conversation, each circle glowing beneath wall sconces and framed charity portraits that seemed to watch the room with rehearsed compassion. The display cases here held the kind of items meant to impress people who had already seen everything. Signed first editions, a vintage Swiss watch, a private Napa Valley retreat, and at the center of the room, beneath a ring of focused white light, a diamond necklace on black velvet with a placard that called it a symbol of hope. Naomi let her gaze pass over it without lingering, then turned toward a long table lined with bid sheets and crystal pens. A young volunteer in a pale blue dress straightened as Naomi approached, her smile warm for half a second before uncertainty dimmed it. "Can I help you?" she asked, and the question carried the kind of softness that still managed to place a wall between them. Naomi returned the look with quiet calm. "I am just browsing," she said. Her voice was low, composed, unmistakably educated, and for a brief moment the volunteer seemed embarrassed by her own hesitation. But before she could answer, another voice slipped into the space like perfume over smoke. "Make sure everything stays where it belongs tonight," said a woman with silver earrings and a champagne flute balanced lightly in manicured fingers. She was smiling when she said it, which somehow made it worse. Naomi turned and found herself facing a donor she had seen featured on more than one society page. A woman whose face wore kindness the way some people wore diamonds, carefully and for effect. The volunteer gave a nervous nod. Of course, Mrs. Davenport. Mrs. Davenport looked at Naomi as if she had not meant for the comment to land, though she clearly had. These events can get crowded, she added, as though that explained everything. Naomi held her gaze a second longer than etiquette required. Yes, she said evenly. Crowded rooms do make it easier to reveal what people assume when they think no one is listening. The donor blinked, smile tightening at the corners, then drifted away with the sudden interest of someone who preferred not to be seen too clearly. Naomi reached for one of the event programs stacked near the bid table and opened it with measured hands. On the inside pages were the expected names, sponsors, speeches, and an order of recognition for the evening. She scanned the lineup once, then closed the program just as her clutch vibrated again. This time the screen briefly lit the inside edge of the bag before going dark. Director Lane. A second missed call. Naomi slipped the phone back without a change in expression. Across the corridor, two uniformed officers had just entered through a side door near the security desk, their dark blue uniforms sharply out of place among satin gowns and designer tuxedos. Most guests barely noticed them. Naomi did. One was tall and broad-shouldered with the restless swagger of a man too comfortable being obeyed. The other walked half a step behind, scanning the room with uncertain eyes. Officer Derek Shaw and Officer Ethan Cole. Naomi did not know their names yet, but she recognized the rhythm immediately. One liked to lead. The other liked not to question. At the far end of the ballroom, the string quartet stopped between songs, and for one suspended breath the room fell still enough for Naomi to hear the clipped sound of dress shoes crossing marble. She looked up. Officer Shaw was already looking at her. Officer Derek Shaw did not rush toward her. Men like him rarely had to. He moved with the slow certainty of someone used to entering a space and watching it reorganize itself around his authority, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor in an even rhythm that drew attention without needing to ask for it. Beside him, Officer Ethan Cole kept his expression neutral, though his eyes flickered with the quiet tension of a man who had not yet decided whether he was witnessing routine security or the beginning of a mistake. Naomi stood where she was, one hand resting lightly against her clutch, the other at her side, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady. Around them, the hum of charity conversation faltered by degrees. First one guest lowered a glass. Then a pair near the donor wall stopped mid-sentence. Then a server paused with a silver tray held in both hands, as if the room itself had begun to sense that something was about to be tested. Shaw stopped 3 feet from Naomi and looked at her invitation table badge, then at her face, then back again, as though the answer he wanted had already been chosen before he arrived. "Ma'am," he said, though the word carried no warmth. "I need to ask what business you have in this section of the event." Naomi lifted her eyes fully to his. "The same business as everyone else here," she replied. "I was invited." Shaw extended his hand, not for a greeting, but for proof. "Invitation." Naomi gave it to him without haste. He studied the embossed card longer than necessary. Ethan leaned slightly closer, reading over his shoulder. The card was authentic. Naomi could tell from the brief shift in Ethan's face that he knew it too. But authenticity was not always the point. Sometimes the point was whether a room would accept that proof once it came from the wrong person. Shaw handed the invitation back with 2 fingers. "You came alone?" he asked. "Yes." "Who are you here with?" "No one." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Interesting." Naomi let the words settle between them. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore had noticed the exchange and was now moving toward them with graceful urgency, one hand gathering the side of her gown, the other still holding a flute of champagne she no longer seemed to remember. Her expression was concerned in the way powerful people often look concerned when the problem is not injustice, but visibility. "Officer," Evelyn said softly as she reached them, "is there an issue?" Shaw did not take his eyes off Naomi. "We are just clarifying a few things." Naomi turned toward Evelyn. "That depends," she said. "Are you interested in clarity, or just comfort?" Evelyn froze for half a heartbeat. Ethan looked away. Shaw's jaw tightened. He did not like losing control of tone. He especially did not like it in front of wealthy witnesses. There has been a report, he said, his voice a little louder now, enough for nearby guests to hear, that someone was seen near the central display shortly before an item was flagged by staff. The words moved through the room like a draft under a locked door. Flagged by staff. Not missing. Not stolen. Not yet. But already dangerous enough to stain. Naomi heard the whisper begin behind her before the sentence had even finished. She was near the necklace. I saw her over there. Did security check her in? It always starts that way, does not it? Not with truth. With atmosphere. With suggestion. With the quiet confidence that suspicion sounds more convincing when it lands on the right skin in the right room. Naomi kept her voice level. Then I assume you intend to speak to everyone who was near the display. Shaw gave a dry exhale that passed for patience. Right now, I am speaking to you. The quartet had stopped completely now. The ballroom seemed to lean in. Cameras from the press corner shifted subtly in their direction. A volunteer at the bid table looked down as if eye contact itself might become evidence. Naomi noticed all of it and still did not move. She had learned long ago that panic only feeds rooms already hungry to misread it. So she stood there beneath the chandelier light, surrounded by silk, suspicion, and polished hypocrisy, and met Officer Derek Shaw's stare with a calm so complete it almost unsettled him more than defiance would have. The room changed the way expensive rooms always do when they sense scandal before facts. Conversations did not stop all at once. They thinned. They bent. They slid sideways into whispers dressed as concern. Naomi could feel it moving around her, not just curiosity but relief, the strange comfort some people find when suspicion lands on someone they already decided was out of place. Evelyn Whitmore drew a slow breath and lowered her champagne glass to a passing tray, finally understanding that this was no longer a private inconvenience. Too many eyes were on them now. Too many phones had tilted upward. Perhaps we can handle this discreetly, she said, her voice smooth, careful, meant for donors and reporters alike. But Officer Shaw seemed to hear discretion as permission. He straightened, widened his stance, and spoke just loudly enough to turn the whole corridor into an audience. Ma'am, I am going to need you to step away from the display and open your bag. Naomi did not blink. On what grounds? She asked. Shaw's expression hardened, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had not. On the grounds that staff raised a concern and you were observed near a high-value item shortly before it was flagged. Naomi let the word settle. High-value item. Flagged. Observed. The language was polished enough to sound official and vague enough to justify almost anything. Ethan Cole shifted beside him. Derek, he said quietly, maybe we should confirm with security before we escalate this. It was the first crack in the moment, small but unmistakable. Shaw did not look at him. We are confirming it right now. Naomi turned slightly toward Ethan, and for a second he seemed embarrassed to meet her eyes. She saw the conflict there, the hesitation of a man who knew the room was moving faster than the evidence. But hesitation was not courage, and tonight that difference would matter. A woman near the donor table covered her mouth as if she were watching something regrettable, though she did not look away. A man in a velvet dinner jacket murmured, "This is exactly why private events need tighter security." Someone else whispered, "I knew something felt off." Naomi heard every word. She had been hearing versions of them her whole life. They changed outfits. They changed zip codes. They changed accents and venues, and the price of the wine being poured nearby. But the meaning never changed. Shaw held out his hand again. The bag. Naomi's voice remained low and precise. You are asking me to submit to a public search based on assumption, not evidence. I am asking you to cooperate. No, she said, and the stillness in her tone landed harder than a shout. You are asking me to make this easy for you. A few people near the back exchanged glances. Even Evelyn looked unsettled now, not by what Naomi said, but by how true it sounded in the open air of the ballroom. Then, from somewhere near the auction desk, a volunteer spoke up too quickly. I think she was standing closest to the necklace case. The words spilled out with the nervous eagerness of someone trying to be useful and becoming dangerous instead. Shaw nodded as if the room had just handed him certainty. There it is. Naomi turned her head toward the young woman, not with anger, but with a disappointment so clear it made the volunteer shrink in place. Closest, Naomi repeated softly. That is all it takes. No one answered. The quartet remained silent. Glasses stood untouched. A camera flash went off from the edge of the room, bright and rude and impossible to take back. Evelyn lifted a hand. "Officer, maybe we should move this to a private area." But Shaw had already committed himself to the performance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now fully public, "if you refuse to comply, I will have to detain you until we sort this out." And there it was. Not truth, not proof, not justice. Just the old machinery wearing a polished badge in a ballroom full of people who preferred comfort over character. Naomi looked at him, then slowly at the crowd gathering around them, then up toward the glowing donor screen above the stage. Her face did not change. "Then do what you came here to do," she said. And for the first time that night, Officer Derek Shaw smiled. Officer Derek Shaw took one small step forward, enough to signal control, enough to make the circle around them tighten like a noose woven from tuxedos, pearls, and polite silence. Naomi did not move. She simply held his gaze while the room waited for her to become what they had already decided she was. "Last chance," Shaw said. His tone had that clipped finality men often use when they want obedience to sound like procedure. Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time that evening, not in submission, but to the black clutch resting against her side. Then, with calm, deliberate hands, she placed it on the edge of the bid table. A few guests leaned in. Someone near the press corner raised a phone higher. Ethan Cole exhaled quietly, as if hoping the moment might still return to something smaller, something reversible. Naomi opened the clasp and drew back her hand. "You may inspect it," she said, "but you will remember this moment exactly as it happened." Shaw gave a short, humorless smile. "That sounds like a threat." "No," Naomi replied. "It sounds like a record." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Even Evelyn Whitmore looked away for a second, her face tightening with the private discomfort of a woman beginning to suspect that the room had crossed an invisible line. Shaw looked inside the clutch with exaggerated care, the kind meant less to search than to perform searching. He removed a compact, a folded event program, a slim leather card holder, lipstick in a deep neutral shade, and a sealed ivory envelope with no name on the front. No necklace, no missing item, no evidence of anything except a woman who had come prepared for an evening that was supposed to honor generosity. The silence that followed should have ended it. It should have embarrassed the room into apology. But shame is a luxury some people never feel when power is standing behind them. Shaw did not step back. He looked past the contents of the bag and toward Naomi again, his jaw locked, his eyes narrowing not with caution, but with frustration. "And the card holder," he said. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You did not ask for my identification. You asked to inspect my bag." Shaw reached for the wallet anyway. Ethan finally spoke with more force than before. "Derek, that is enough. We did not find anything." But the sentence did not restore reason. It only exposed how badly reason had already been losing. Around them, the crowd shifted from certainty to anticipation. That was the ugliest part. Some of them were no longer sure she had done anything, but they still wanted the scene. They wanted the resolution to justify the discomfort they had already invested in. Mrs. Davenport stood near a marble column with one hand at her necklace, watching with open fascination. The volunteer in the pale blue dress stared at the floor like she was afraid her own words might still be floating in the air. A camera lens from the media section zoomed closer. Naomi noticed all of it, then glanced once more toward the giant screen above the stage. The donor reel had ended. A title card now stood still in gold lettering against black velvet graphics. Special recognition in 5 minutes. Underneath, staff members gathered near the stage stairs with clipboards and headsets, their movements growing increasingly hurried, increasingly tense. One of them looked toward Naomi, then froze. A man near the sound booth touched his earpiece and turned pale. Evelyn saw it too. "Officer Shaw," she said, and this time the polished hostess voice cracked at the edge. "I think you need to pause this right now." But Shaw was no longer listening to the room. He was listening to himself, to the part of him that had already gone too far to retreat with grace. He picked up the leather card holder, opened it, and for the briefest second the color drained from Ethan Cole's face. Naomi saw the shift before anyone else did. Ethan had read the top line. He looked from the identification back to Naomi as though the floor beneath. The ballroom had just changed shape. Shaw had not processed it yet. Not fully. Not until he turned the card toward the light. For a moment, Officer Derek Shaw did not understand what he was looking at. His eyes moved across the identification once, then again, slower the second time, as if the printed words might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous if he stared hard enough. They did not. The polished confidence that had carried him through the last several minutes faltered in a way only Naomi and Ethan seemed able to recognize at first. It was not fear yet. It was confusion, followed by the first cold touch of realization. Ethan leaned closer, his voice barely more than air. "Derek," that was all he said, but it was enough. Shaw's fingers tightened on the card holder. Across the room, the giant screen above the stage flickered. A low musical cue began to swell through the ballroom speakers, soft and ceremonial, the kind played before a keynote introduction or a major announcement. Several guests turned instinctively toward the stage, grateful for any distraction from the tension at the auction corridor. But then the master of ceremonies stepped into the spotlight with a smile that lasted exactly 1 second before his gaze landed on Naomi. The smile disappeared. He looked down at the card in his hand, back up at Naomi, then toward Evelyn Whitmore with open alarm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice thinner than it had been all evening. "In just a moment, we will be honoring a very special guest whose work has changed the national conversation around accountability, ethics, and public trust." The words struck the room like a current. Naomi did not rescue anyone from the moment. She simply stood there while the truth began walking toward them on its own. Evelyn pressed her fingers to her temple. "Oh my God," she whispered, not to Naomi, not really, but to herself, to the cameras, to the disaster taking shape inside her carefully managed night. Shaw slowly lowered the identification card, but he did not hand it back. Not yet. Some part of him was still trying to preserve the old order, still trying to believe that if he delayed long enough, authority might return to him. "This does not prove anything," he said, though even he no longer believed it. Naomi's eyes never left his. "No," she said calmly. "It proves exactly how little you needed before deciding who I was." Then the screen changed. The black velvet background dissolved into a formal portrait of Naomi Brooks standing in a charcoal suit before an American flag, her expression composed, intelligent, unmistakable. Beneath the photograph appeared gold lettering large enough for every person in the ballroom to read from across the room. Deputy Attorney General Naomi Brooks, Special Honoree for National Leadership in Public Integrity. The ballroom stopped breathing. There was no other way to describe it. Glasses remained suspended halfway to lips. Conversations died in people's throats. A woman near the stage actually took 1 step backward as if the image itself had pushed her. The same phones that had risen to record Naomi's humiliation now tilted toward the screen, toward Shaw, toward Evelyn, toward the terrible symmetry of a room that had celebrated justice from a safe distance until justice turned out to be standing in front of them all along. Ethan's face went pale. He looked at Naomi, then at Shaw, then at the identification still in Shaw's hand like it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Mrs. Davenport lowered her eyes at last, but not before Naomi saw shame arrive too late to matter. The volunteer in the pale blue dress covered her mouth with trembling fingers. On stage, the master of ceremonies had gone silent, his script hanging uselessly at his side. Officer Derek Shaw finally looked around and understood the size of the ruin. Not because Naomi had raised her voice, not because anyone had threatened him, but because every witness in that ballroom now saw the same thing with terrifying clarity. He had not exposed a criminal. He had exposed himself. And Naomi, still calm, still perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, extended one open hand and said, "My identification, officer." For 2 full seconds, no one moved. The ballroom, which had been so eager to judge, so quick to gather around suspicion dressed as procedure, now stood trapped inside the kind of silence money could not soften and influence could not rewrite. Officer Derek Shaw looked at Naomi's outstretched hand as if it belonged to someone he had never really seen until now. Then, with the stiffness of a man discovering too late that arrogance has a witness list, he placed the identification back into her palm. Naomi slid it into the leather holder, returned it to her clutch, and closed the clasp with a small, precise click that seemed louder than the orchestra, louder than the cameras, louder than the shallow breathing now moving through the room. Evelyn Whitmore was the first to recover enough to speak. though even then her voice came out thinner than the polished authority she had worn all evening. Deputy Attorney General Brooks, I am so deeply sorry for this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. There it was. The favorite word of people who wanted bias to sound accidental and humiliation to sound administrative. Naomi turned toward her slowly. A misunderstanding happens when two people mishear each other, she said. What happened here was a decision. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no sentence survived long enough to reach it. On stage, the master of ceremonies still stood frozen beneath the spotlight, one hand gripping his note cards so tightly that the corners bent. Behind him, the screen continued to display Naomi's portrait and title in elegant gold letters, each one now functioning less like an honor and more like an indictment. Deputy Attorney General, Public Integrity, National Leadership. The room had spent the last 10 minutes trying to reduce her to suspicion, and now every title behind her threw that failure back into their faces with brutal clarity. Ethan Cole stepped back first. It was not dramatic. It was almost invisible, but Naomi noticed. So did Shaw. Ethan had crossed from uncertainty into awareness, and awareness had finally brought distance with it. He cleared his throat, eyes fixed somewhere just past Naomi's shoulder. Ma'am, he said quietly, I should have intervened sooner. Naomi studied him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the measured seriousness of someone who understood that delayed. Conscience is still delay. Yes, she said. You should have. Ethan lowered his head. It was not redemption. It was simply truth. Shaw, meanwhile, seemed to be unraveling one layer at a time beneath the weight of public recognition. The self-assurance had drained from his face, leaving behind something harder to watch than anger. Not shame exactly. More like the shock of a man who had always mistaken confidence for correctness and was now discovering the difference in front of an audience. He looked around the ballroom as if searching for someone who might still validate what he had done. No one did. Not Evelyn. Not Ethan. Not the donors. Not the reporters now recording every shift in his expression. Not even the guests who had whispered their agreement moments earlier. That is the thing about cowardice in expensive clothes. It is loud when it thinks power is on its side, and silent the moment consequences arrive. Naomi reached into her clutch and took out the sealed ivory envelope Shaw had discarded as irrelevant just minutes earlier. She held it between two fingers, then turned toward the stage. You were about to introduce me, she said to the master of ceremonies. He nodded too quickly, relief and panic colliding in his face. Yes, ma'am. We were. Naomi lifted the envelope slightly. Then let us not waste the room's attention. The words moved through the crowd like a second shock wave. Evelyn's expression changed first. Confusion gave way to dread. Near the donor wall, Mrs. Davenport visibly stiffened. A man from the sound booth touched his headset again, whispering urgently to someone Naomi could not see. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from embarrassment to fear, and not the broad, public fear of scandal. This was narrower, sharper, the kind of fear that comes when people begin wondering whether the person they humiliated was not just important, but informed. Naomi walked toward the stage with the same calm she had entered with, her heels quiet against the polished floor, her back straight, her pace unhurried. The crowd parted for her without being asked. Nobody wanted to be in her path now. Nobody wanted to be seen blocking the woman they had just watched being judged, searched, and doubted beneath the banner of charity. As she reached the bottom of the stage stairs, she stopped and turned back, not to the audience, but directly to Officer Derek Shaw. Her voice remained level, but every word landed with surgical force. You thought the worst thing in this room was what might be missing from a display case, she said. It is not. Then she looked across the ballroom, from the donors to the cameras to Evelyn Whitmore, standing motionless under the chandelier light, and added, It is what is hidden in plain sight. Naomi stepped onto the stage without waiting for permission, and the room gave it to her anyway. That was the difference now. 10 minutes earlier they had treated her presence like a question. Now the same people watched her as if every movement might decide the fate of the night. The master of ceremonies moved aside so quickly he nearly dropped his cards. Naomi took the center of the stage beneath the white beam of the spotlight, the ivory envelope still in her hand, her face composed, her breathing even, her voice calm when she finally spoke. Before I accept any recognition this evening, she said, there are a few matters of public integrity that need to be addressed. The words did not echo. They landed. Every person in the ballroom seemed to straighten at once. Donors who had spent the evening smiling for cameras now stood rigid beneath crystal chandeliers. Reporters at the back of the room leaned forward, instinct replacing etiquette. Evelyn Whitmore remained near the auction corridor, one hand lightly pressed against her ribs, her polished confidence draining with every second Naomi continued to stand in that light. Naomi lifted the envelope and broke the seal with precise fingers. There was no drama in the motion. That was what made it so devastating. Drama begs for attention. Certainty does not. She drew out a folded set of documents and placed them on the podium. For the past 11 months, she said, a federal task force under my supervision has been reviewing financial discrepancies involving charitable foundations, donor advisement groups, and event-based fundraising channels, operating across New York, Connecticut, and the District of Columbia. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not noise. Not yet. Just the subtle electrical twitch of a room realizing it might be standing inside a story far bigger than the one it had just created. Naomi continued. Tonight's gala was not selected at random. It was one of several events flagged for document tracing, shell transfers, and restricted donor routing concealed under philanthropic branding. The silence that followed felt colder than the winter air outside the hotel. A man near the back lowered his wine glass too quickly, and it struck the cocktail table with a dull click. Mrs. Davenport's face lost its color. At the sound booth, the same staffer who had whispered into his headset now stopped moving entirely. Evelyn finally found her voice. That is absurd, she said, but even from across the ballroom the weakness in the sentence was visible. Naomi turned toward her, not sharply, just enough to include her in the truth. Is it? She asked. Because the records say otherwise. She lifted one sheet. Wire transfers routed through secondary education trusts. Another. Pledges recorded publicly at one amount and internally at another. Another. Vendor contracts connected to entities with no active service history and no physical office beyond mailbox registrations. The room was no longer embarrassed. It was terrified. Officer Derek Shaw, still standing near the auction corridor, looked as though he had forgotten where to put his hands. The situation he had tried to control had become something he could not even comprehend. Ethan Cole stared at the stage with the fixed expression of a man watching consequences form in real time. Naomi looked out over the ballroom, over the diamonds and tuxedos and carefully rehearsed compassion, and her gaze settled for a brief second on the display case that had started all of this. The missing necklace was never the point, she said. It was moved by event staff during a scheduled verification check at 8:14 p.m. Security logs confirmed that. Heads turned instantly toward the display, then toward Evelyn, then toward the officers. Shaw's face tightened. He knew what that meant. He had detained the only person in the room who had not needed to be questioned at all. Naomi let the realization spread before speaking again. But assumptions move faster than facts when the room is already prepared to believe the wrong story. No one disputed her. No one could. Several phones were openly recording now, and the camera operators near the rear aisle had abandoned subtlety altogether. This was no longer a charity event. It was evidence with chandeliers. Naomi placed both hands lightly on the podium. No one is leaving this ballroom until federal liaisons arrive, she said. Gasps broke out at last, small and scattered. All event footage is to be preserved. All digital check-in logs are to remain active. Hotel security is to lock exterior access points and maintain guest presence without interference. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. People obeyed tone long before they obeyed volume. 2 hotel security supervisors near the side entrance immediately touched their earpieces. Across the room, Evelyn looked like she might speak again, then thought better of it. Shaw took one half step forward as if instinct still wanted to challenge the order, but Ethan touched his arm. This time Derek listened. Naomi's eyes moved over him once, steady and unreadable. Officer Shaw, she said, you made a public decision without public evidence. Stay exactly where you are. And under the lights of a ballroom built to celebrate generosity, with every whisper gone and every camera fixed in place, the man who had tried to define her with suspicion stood still because, for the first time that night, he understood what real authority sounded like. Federal liaisons arrived 12 minutes later. But by then the ballroom had already been transformed by something far more powerful than badges or cameras. It had been transformed by clarity, the kind that strips away performance, the kind that leaves no place for polished excuses to hide. Guests who had entered the evening expecting applause, soft music, and photographs beside oversized checks now stood in tense little clusters beneath the chandeliers, careful not to speak too loudly, careful not to be seen speaking to the wrong person. Hotel security had sealed the exits with quiet efficiency. Reporters at the rear of the room were no longer chasing a charity story. They were documenting a collapse. Naomi remained at the podium, one hand resting lightly against the stack of documents, the other at her side, her posture unchanged. She had not needed to raise her voice once all night. Truth had done that work for her. Evelyn Whitmore sat in a gold-trimmed chair near the front row now, no longer drifting through the room like a queen of benevolence. She looked smaller seated there, smaller without motion, smaller without control. Across from her, Mrs. Davenport kept both hands wrapped around an untouched glass of water, as though holding still might make her invisible. Officer Ethan Cole stood near the wall with his shoulders drawn tight, watching events unfold with the hollow expression of a man who had discovered too late that silence has a cost. And Officer Derek Shaw, the man who had walked into the corridor with certainty in every step, now stood where Naomi had instructed him to stay, under the full gaze of cameras, donors, staff, and law enforcement officials who had begun quietly separating witnesses from participants. Imagine that moment. Imagine being so certain someone did not belong that you never once asked whether the room belonged to the truth. Naomi looked toward the ballroom doors as a team in dark suits entered, led by a woman with silver-framed glasses and a federal credentials wallet already in hand. Director Lane. Her face was composed, her pace efficient, her presence enough to send a fresh wave of anxiety through the room. She approached the stage, exchanged a brief look with Naomi, then nodded once. No theatrics, no whispered panic, just confirmation. This was real. Always had been. Lane turned to the room and identified herself, then directed her team with the clean precision of people trained to let procedure speak for itself. One group moved toward event records, another toward the donor registration systems, a third toward the security control room. Every motion was calm, which somehow made it all feel even more final. Naomi stepped away from the podium then, not because she was retreating, but because the work no longer needed a speech. It needed witness. As she descended the stage stairs, every eye followed her. Some looked ashamed. Some looked frightened. Some looked as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time and hated what that revelation said about themselves. She walked past Evelyn Whitmore, who rose halfway as though apology might still be useful. Deputy Attorney General Brooks, Evelyn said, her voice shaking under the weight of titles that now meant nothing. I never intended for any of this to happen. Naomi stopped, but only for a second. That is the problem, she said. Too many people never intend the harm they are perfectly willing to allow. Then she turned toward Derek Shaw. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to ask for a kind of understanding he had denied the moment he first looked at her and decided suspicion fit better than respect. But no sentence came. Naomi spared him the struggle. You did not need evidence, she said. You only needed me to be the kind of person you were ready to believe the worst about. Shaw dropped his eyes. For the first time that night, no one rushed to protect him from what he had done. No crowd, no hostess, no room full of whispered agreement. Just silence, honest silence, the kind that arrives when a lie loses all its furniture. Naomi let that silence stand for a moment longer before speaking one final time, not just to him, not just to Evelyn, but to everyone in that ballroom and everyone beyond it who would one day hear the story. The danger was never that you did not know my title, she said. The danger was how quickly you measured my worth before you did. No one answered. No one could. Because under the chandelier light, with cameras rolling and files opening and false appearances falling apart one by one, the lesson had already settled into the room like something permanent. Power can be abused. Wealth can be staged. Charity can be branded. But truth has a way of walking into the same room as arrogance and making it stand still. And that night, in a ballroom built to celebrate appearances, justice arrived without needing to announce itself at all.